We're not crazy, the system is. Tune in to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Wednesdays, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJLP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio. Produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, streaming live, podcasting, and archived at madnessradio.net. Hi, everybody. This is Will Hall. I'm your host here on Madness Radio. Thanks for joining us. I'm really excited today because our guest is John Horgan, who is a science journalist. He was a former senior writer at Scientific American and writes frequently for Discover Magazine, New York Times, Times Literary Supplement. And he writes a lot about neuroscience and genetics and this whole question of what are the limits of scientific knowledge. First, just a few things about Madness Radio. We're sponsored by the Freedom Center and by the Icarus Project. Freedom Center is a local support, activism, and advocacy group run by and for people who have different mental disorder labels like schizophrenia or bipolar or depression, and who are looking for alternative ways of understanding what we go through. And we have a lot of different holistic services that we offer, including free acupuncture, free yoga. We have a support group. There are events coming up. We have a protest coming up on July 29th. And you can find out more information about the Freedom Center and what we're up to by going to freedom-center.org. Madness Radio is also co-sponsored by the Icarus Project, which is a mostly internet-based group, but also there are local groups around the country of people who have different mental disorder diagnoses like bipolar and other related labels, and who are looking for other ways of understanding what we go through beyond the medical model, especially creativity and spirituality. You can check out the website for the Icarus Project, which is theicarusproject.net. So I was really blown away by John Horgan's books, The Undiscovered Mind, how the human brain defies replication, medication, and explanation, and his book Rational Mysticism. And John is just a very, very sharp, skeptical, brilliant thinker who takes science seriously, but he looks very deep into what it claims and what it really can't claim despite what it wants to claim. And he's been someone who's criticized the excitement about antidepressant drugs. He's been very critical of genetics and neuroscience, but in a very sophisticated way that comes from really understanding the ins and outs of what actually scientific research is all about. So, John, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here, Will.
Well, I really enjoyed your book, The Undiscovered Mind, and also your book, Rational Mysticism, was really amazing to me. I love how you bring a real skeptic's attitude with a scientist's precision to this question of, like, what does science know and what does science not know?
Yeah, well, both of those books were really, in a sense, follow-up books to my first book, which is called The End of Science. That came out in '96, and as the title suggests, in The End of Science, I tried to argue that all the really great discoveries are behind us in science. The big paradigmatic discoveries like quantum mechanics and evolution and DNA and the Big Bang. So obviously there's a lot left to learn about how the universe works, but mostly it will consist of filling in the details of the big picture that we already have. Now, the big exception to that, as many critics pointed out in reviews of The End of Science, is the study of the brain and mind. And so in Undiscovered Mind, I talked about neuroscience and psychology and so forth in The End of Science, but I didn't really give them as much attention as they deserve, considering how tremendously important they are. So in Undiscovered Mind and then in Rational Mysticism, I really focused on what science can tell us about ourselves, or about what it can't tell us, what the limits of science are.
Well, let's maybe get started with neuroscience then, because we've got this real belief in medication as being sort of the way to unlock mental states and help people who are having mental distress or mental illness. And you really point out the limits of that. And I think what's interesting is that you have a chapter talking about the way in which psychotherapy, and especially even Freudian psychotherapy, is still around, because no one's really been able to kind of prove anything is much better. They all sort of end up being equally good or equally not so good.
The original title of Undiscovered Mind, when I first came up with the idea for this book and started pitching it to publishers, was Why Freud Isn't Dead. And what I meant by that was that Freudian theories were first proposed about 100 years ago, and they became enormously successful, especially in the United States within the next few decades, but they've been attacked viciously since the very beginning. Psychoanalysis has been attacked both as a theory of the mind and human behavior and as a treatment for all of our disorders. And you constantly have these proclamations coming out that Freud is dead. Modern science has finally shown that Freudian theories don't work either as theories or as therapies for the mind. But obviously, if Freud was really dead, we wouldn't have to keep announcing that he's dead. Freudian theories are still as viable as any other theories of the mind. There has been, in spite of all the progress of modern neuroscience and genetics and all these other fields that attempt to explain human behavior, there hasn't been a theory that's been powerful enough to displace Freud once and for all. And that works both at the theoretical level and the therapeutic level.
So say more about that. I mean, how can that be? We tend to think of science as constantly marching forward, and Freud is sort of a Victorian theory. And don't we have these sort of neuroscientific, the neurotransmitter theories and serotonin and dopamine and all these sort of brain chemistry theories now? Don't those really prove to be superior in the end? Well,
it's sort of this strange paradox. So you obviously have this flood of data coming in from neuroscientific research. We've got all these really powerful instruments for understanding the brain. We've uncovered all these neurotransmitters in the brain, all these different genes that regulate the development of the brain. We've developed all these drugs that supposedly can ameliorate the effects of mental illness, and there are all these theories of how depression and manic depression and schizophrenia stem from disorders of neurotransmitters. But what neuroscience still hasn't given us is what you might call a unified theory of the brain or mind. And in fact, at this point, there is such a tremendous confusion of findings coming from neuroscience and genetics that it's almost impossible to imagine how somebody could come up with a unified theory. In a way, the reason that Freud could successfully propose a unified theory of the mind and behavior 100 years ago was because there was so little real, hard, empirical data to contradict him. Nowadays, if somebody wants to propose a theory like this, you have to account for this tremendous variety of often contradictory findings about how the brain works. So you have a kind of almost like an anti-progress. The more that scientists study the brain and mind, the more confused they become about how they work.
I think that really shows to be true when you just follow the media. It seems like every day almost there's some finding from some research somewhere saying, we've discovered that this gene plays a role in bipolar, or this neurochemistry, serotonin or neurotransmitter is behind some mental disorder, and then there's something totally different that comes out the following week.
Well, and this is especially true of psychopharmacology. So I have a chapter in Undiscovered Mind called Prozac and Other Placebos. And in that I show that there have been these claims of tremendous progress in treating very common disorders like like depression, and Prozac and the whole class of SSRIs were supposed to represent this great step forward in treating depression. But what the clinical trials actually show, and this is what I pointed out in Undiscovered Mind, is that SSRIs are really no more effective at treating depression than the older class of antidepressants, the tricyclics. And all these drugs as a whole aren't really any more effective at treating depression and other common disorders than plain old psychotherapy, including psychoanalysis. So you have this impression of progress that's actually not in accord with what the clinical data show. Now, it made me uncomfortable to be pointing out some of these things. When I was working on Undiscovered Mind, and that was sort of the most controversial and I thought attention-getting material that I was working with, this critique of especially of antidepressants, because I have lots of friends who are taking antidepressants and have sworn that they have made a tremendous difference in their lives. And
absolutely.
I don't.
Absolutely. I have the same experience in my life. Many people I come across swear by as antidepressants and SRIs as lifesavers, and of course they work. And yeah,
that's
so
right.
yeah.
It's just that and this was this is a theme of the book Listening to Prozac, which is a big bestseller back in the early '90s, and really helped to sort of create this wave of enthusiasm for Prozac and other antidepressants. But if you just look, again, as a science writer, I just have to keep going back to what the data actually tell us. And, the data to say that these drugs really, as I said before, they aren't this great step forward. And you have to remember that a lot of people still swear by psychoanalysis, or they swear by cognitive behavioral therapy, or they swear by, there's so many different things that people claim make them feel better when they're trying to struggle with one or another of these disorders.
Yeah, that was one of the main, because I work with the Freedom Center, and we're a support group as well as activism and education. And that was one of the things we really have emphasized, is that, look, it's up to the individual to decide for themselves what they feel works for them. And it's kind of really can't argue with that in a sense. And I think one of the things that's important for listeners to recognize is that your book, The Undiscovered Mind, when you're making these points, came out in 1999, and we've seen in the last 7 years, everything that you've just said has been absolutely borne out to be true in the mainstream media. These studies have consistently come out challenging kind of the initial hype and enthusiasm around the new class of drugs. So that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on the show, because I think you're really looking very deeply and very accurately at these issues. Now, John, you mentioned the placebo effect.
Thank you for saying that, Will, because I was absolutely hammered when Undiscovered Mind came out, because I was ahead of the curve on this, and there was a reviewer in the New York Times who said just said that my claim that SSRIs weren't any more effective than previous drugs was just absolutely absurd. And it was contradicted by books like Listening to Prozac. So, thank you for pointing out that now what I'm saying is almost received wisdom.
Well, it's important to remember that, the mainstream media often is just completely trapped in a very narrow way of looking at things. I think that there's some historical record that when the Wright brothers actually flew at Kitty Hawk, the media, the New York Times, was completely unwilling to look at the facts of the people they had actually flown. And I'm also reminded of a review of I had Richard de Grandpré, who is author of Listening, author of Ritalin Nation. I had him on the show a few weeks ago, and his book was reviewed by Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell is one of the most preeminent science writers probably in the world. He's a New Yorker writer, and
he's certainly the best-selling science
absolutely
writer in the
world. That's true. He may not have quite the reputation in the science world, but he's certainly one of the most popular. and very well respected New Yorker writer. And in his review, he referred to Ritalin as not being addictive. And I was just kind of shocked by this, but actually that was at one point in the introduction of Ritalin and the promotion of ADHD, it was kind of commonly believed that, oh, well, these drugs aren't addictive. And now it's, of course, received wisdom that, well, actually, Ritalin is a stimulant and it's addictive. So I think it's important for us to be, as you are, skeptical. You had brought up the issue of the placebo effect, and maybe tell us a little bit more about how you would define that and how actually powerful it is, because I think that's one of the most amazing stories about the mind and science and what helps people and what doesn't help is really this question of the placebo effect.
Yeah, the placebo effect is fascinating. It's right at the heart of this whole, this ancient riddle, the mind-body riddle. How does the mind influence the body, and vice versa? And should we really think of them as two different things? So the placebo effect has always been sort of dismissed by physicians as the result of wishful thinking, this kind of very ephemeral psychological effect that, if you believe something is going to help you get better, then you also might have some kind of passing feeling of good health. But modern research has shown that it is a very concrete, real phenomenon. So, for example, when it comes to, again, antidepressants and drugs like this, there is very little difference between the response of people to antidepressants and to placebos. So if you just give people a sugar pill and tell them that it's going to make them feel better, a substantial portion of those people will feel better in response to that. In fact, there's a psychiatrist at Brown University, I quoted him in the Undiscovered Mind, who has recommended that given that all antidepressants now, all psychiatric drugs have some side effects. For example, the SSRIs, some of them have an effect on sexual libido. This guy, whose name is Brown, and he's actually at Brown University, has suggested that placebos be the first treatment for people with mild to moderate depression, because he says that many studies have shown that placebo pills work even when people are told that it's a placebo.
That's what's so shocking.
For example, the doctor can give somebody a pill and say, "This is an inert pill. There are no active medications in this pill, but studies have shown that if you take it, there's a substantial chance that you will feel better," and that's what actually occurs. So I think that this is a tremendously interesting area for researchers to study. There is a tremendous amount of interest in this right now, particularly on how the placebo effect is sort of modulated by the immune system, for example. So, I would love to write another book on the placebo effect alone at some point in the future.
Yeah, please do, because it's an absolutely fascinating, it completely is mind-boggling and deeply mysterious that even someone could actually be given a placebo and told that it's a placebo and it still has that effect. And I think in the pharmaceutical, when they actually try and do the clinical trials to show the effectiveness of new psychiatric drugs, they actually, I think, select out people who are called placebo responders, that they wash those people out of the studies because they're trying to show that it has some more effect than the placebo effect, than the placebo does.
And of course, that distorts the
exactly.
That provides a distorted picture of what the drug's effects will be in the general population.
Exactly, and the distorted picture kind of holds sway for as long as the drug is very profitable, and then eventually things come out, and then they move on to a new drug, it seems. So I wanted to ask you about this question of placebo a little bit more deeply, because it also affects like really serious medical conditions. I know that there are like placebo surgeries and different kinds of placebo treatments for serious medical problems that have effectiveness as well. Is that true?
Well, yeah. I mean, what's happened a number of times recently is that there is a treatment that has been used, for example, for treating heart disease, a surgical procedure, the insertion of a stent into a cardiac artery, something like that, and it's been used very successfully for years and years. And there was a recent case, and I think it was involving a very common stent procedure, where somebody thought, well, something, let's carry out a controlled study of this and see how it holds up compared to placebo. And so they actually carried out a study in which people who received stents were compared to those who simply had a surgical incision made in their chest, but nothing was actually inserted into it. And the people who just had the incision did as well afterwards as the people who had the stent inserted into their chest. And so this procedure was immediately discontinued because everybody realized that the success rate had been due entirely to placebos. Now, I just have to tell you, I mentioned this in Undiscovered Mind, placebos work even on animals, on non-human animals.
Oh, I had no idea. That's incredible. Wow, I had no idea about that.
Well, there's a famous study. There's something called the nocebo effect, which is it's the flip side of so the placebo effect is obviously a positive effect. You get better because you think you're going to get better. The nocebo effect is when you get worse because you expect to get worse because of something that's happening to you. So there was this study done, I think in the 1970s, and I think it was the University of Rochester, in which the researchers gave this a solution that was very bitter to some rats that contained, I think it was an immune suppressing drug that made them very susceptible to various kinds of diseases. And so they sort of trained a population of rats to associate this bitter taste with this illness that they would get by drinking this stuff. So then what they did was they gave just the bitter solution with no immune-suppressing drug in it to the rats, and more than half of the rats still got sick, and some even died as a result of this nocebo effect. So their brains had somehow trained them to expect that they would become ill because of drinking this bitter solution, and as a result of that, they did become ill.
Yeah.
Again, this just shows that this isn't some kind of totally psychological, psychosomatic effect. It's something that is very physiological and tangible.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible, and the implications are just so far-reaching. One of the things that it makes me think of is that the whole realm of alternative health and holistic healing, and of course, the placebo effect is obviously a huge factor in that. The question is sort of, what are the side effects? So if we have the placebo effect is very effective with people, why not use treatments that are harmless or non-toxic rather than risky treatments or psychiatric drug treatments or surgical treatments, these kinds of things? Just if there's no reason to have that risk there because the placebo effect is so powerful. But I do hope that you continue to do research on this because it's an incredibly fascinating area. And I just wanted to turn now to the whole question of genetics, because you talk a lot about that in the Undiscovered Mind, and I know that your current work is a lot about something called the neural code, and we're often told that the gene for schizophrenia or the gene for bipolar disorder is right around the corner, and pretty soon we're going to be screening unborn children for whether they have these susceptibilities or they're going to get these diseases. And what's your view of all that, the genetic side of things?
I originally did a big article for Scientific American in the early 90s on what's called behavioral genetics. So it's the attempt to find specific genes underlying complex traits or disorders. So people were looking for genes for some of the major mental illnesses, schizophrenia, manic depression, also depression, disorders such as alcoholism, drug addiction, and also some behavioral traits. And one of the most controversial was homosexuality, but also impulsive behavior, these sort of personality traits. And there was this wave of claims starting really in the late 80s when biotechnology was first offering some techniques that allowed researchers to search for specific genes associated with specific disorders. And there was this wave of claims of discoveries of specific genes for alcoholism, schizophrenia, manic depression, impulsive behavior, and male homosexuality. So I was, needless to say, I thought, this is a very exciting trend. I started gathering material for a big article on it in Scientific American, and what I found was that in every one of these cases, you had an initial paper that was announced with great fanfare in Nature or Science or some major journal, and then there would be all this other publicity. The New York Times was running a whole series of front-page articles on these findings. In every case, follow-up studies would fail to corroborate the initial finding, but you wouldn't read about those failures to corroborate. And so there was this impression that we're explaining everything that we are, the good and the bad, in terms of these specific genes. And it led to all these visions of designer babies and re-engineered humans, and it was all based on a false premise that scientists are actually discovering the genes associated with all these complex traits and disorders. Now, that was in the early 90s. I wrote an article in Scientific American that, again, was enormously controversial. I took a lot of heat for this article because at the time, everybody was still basically just accepting all these claims for the genetic basis of complex traits. But that has really held up over the last decade. Now, these claims still are coming out, but again, still in every case, you never get the kind of corroboration that you need to be sure that the claims are correct.
John,
so all this talk about designer babies and this sort of eugenic future for humanity still are not based on real science.
John, why do you think that there's such an enthusiasm for genetic explanations? And you mentioned eugenics, and for me it has a kind of a chilling kind of side to it of social Darwinism and even going back to the Nazis. But why is there so much enthusiasm for this in your view?
Well, it's complicated. First of all, as a science writer, I can tell you that when you read something that says there is a single genetic mutation that's responsible for addiction to gambling, for example, my initial reaction would be, wow, that's really cool. That's amazing. It's just kind of a pure gee whiz reaction. I think politically things have gotten a lot more complicated. So traditionally, as you just said, genetic explanations of human behavior tend to be associated with the right, with the Nazis, and conservatives in other countries. But the eugenics movement originally, back at the beginning in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, was heavily populated with intellectual liberals who thought that eugenics really was sort of the future of humanity and didn't associate it with totalitarianism. They saw it as potentially the liberation of humanity. Now, in over the last couple of decades, genetic explanations of mental illness are seen as a way of absolving parents, for example, of responsibility for having created schizophrenic children through their bad parenting. I think that's actually a very positive result of some of this research. I mean, twin studies really do establish that there's a genetic basis for schizophrenia and manic depression and some of these other illnesses. When it comes to homosexuality, I think some gay activists have embraced genetic explanations because they don't like the idea that homosexuality is just this lifestyle choice, that it's something that trivial. So the politics of genetics are much more complicated now than they used to be, and there are lots of reasons why these explanations are very attractive to all sorts of different groups. But what I keep coming back to is the science. Is the science there? And so far it isn't.
John, you mentioned the twin studies thing, and I really want to kind of pin you down on this because like a little warning bell went off, because I know that there are studies, identical twins don't have the same rates of schizophrenia or manic depression. So we know that if since they have the same genes, it can't be caused by those genes. But we do know that there are some studies that show that there seem to be higher rates among identical twins for things like what get diagnosed as schizophrenia or bipolar. But I have kind of two questions to pose. One is, isn't it true that the labels and diagnoses themselves, schizophrenia and bipolar, manic depression, are themselves kind of really fuzzy from a scientific standpoint? And secondly, I know that in your book, The Undiscovered Mind, you look more deeply at the twin studies, and they often don't quite hold up as much as they're claimed to be. So what do you make of the genetic role in what gets labeled or diagnosed as mental illnesses?
Yeah, in Undiscovered Mind, I looked, and actually in the article that I did for Scientific American back in the early 80s, I looked very closely, particularly at twin studies done by a group at the University of Minnesota, which has been gathering identical twins, especially those who were separated at birth and raised by different families for decades now. And they published some of these astonishing claims, which makes it sound as though genes determine virtually everything that we are. And so they not only have these sort of statistical arguments to back this up, but stories about the Minnesota twin research almost invariably mention some of these extraordinary coincidences that occur when twins separated at birth are reunited, where in one case you had these two guys who had both been raised by different families in different states, but they both ended up as firemen. They both ended up married to women with the same name. They both named their kids with the same names. They had dogs that had the same names. They both liked Budweiser. All this kind of crazy stuff. And this is just wonderful fodder, again, for science writers. But the message to me is very creepy. I mean, it's just the worst kind of genetic determinism. It suggests that genes don't only give us these sort of general propensities for behavior, they determine our lives in every particular. Now, what I showed was that if you look at the twin studies of the Minnesota group more closely, you find that some of these twins who were separated from birth, supposedly separated at birth, actually had contact throughout their lives, and some of them had incentives for exaggerating these strange coincidences. Some of them were getting movie deals. There was one example of twins who were separated at birth. One became a Nazi. They were both Jewish, but one was raised by a German family and became a Nazi, whereas the other one was a devout Jew, and then they got together and they got a movie deal out of this. And so, these sorts of stories, these kind of anecdotal stories, have led to a totally exaggerated picture of the role of genes in our lives. The statistics of the Minnesota group have also been heavily weighted toward the genetic side of things in a way that other studies by other groups don't show.
Yeah, we've had a couple of times on the show. We've had Robert Whitaker, whose book Mad in America looks at a lot of this, and a lot of the science just doesn't hold up, as you're pointing out. And of course, the folks who are not scientists or not science writers were kind of at the mercy of how the think about it. I mean, I know from my friends who have children that, babies definitely seem to have some kind of intrinsic temperament. They definitely don't come into the world just a completely blank slate. But the question is, if that temperament is biological or genetic, how does it express itself? Because someone may be sensitive, they may be artistic, they may have creative side to them, they may have a sort of a vulnerability to them or an openness to them, and whether or not that turns into something that's socially designed or socially defined as schizophrenia or expresses itself as manic depression. There's so many intermediary stages that go in between there. What do you make of that kind of view of it?
I've got two kids. They both were born with their own unique temperaments. My wife and I, we have to believe that we have an impact on them as they develop. But there is this sort of core there. And I think that twin studies and other studies have demonstrated that there is an innate temperament that we're all born with, and that makes each of us an individual. I also believe that there is something called human nature, which is determined by genes that have been shaped over millions of years by evolution. But the nature-nurture debate is so old, and it's always been the same answer. There's this complex interaction between genes and the environment. The genetic determinists are really holding sway in science right now for some of the reasons that I just tried to articulate before. But environment is just as important as ever.
Yeah, and there's also the question of like prenatal environment, the way in which the actual gestation process can have environmental influences. And there would be people that would say that there are influences that go prior to birth as well. So it's a very complicated question, and it sort of raises. Well, before I move on to that, let me ask you this. Maybe one of the ways to understand this is that genetic determinism kind of sees that there's a blueprint, but isn't it true that a lot of the more recent genetic theory is seeing genes as being able to be turned off and turned on by the environment? Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because it gives me a chance to mention this weekly science show that I do on something called Blogging Heads TV. It's called Science Saturday, and I do it with a great science writer, writes a lot for the New York Times, named George Johnson. And the URL is bloggingheads.tv. It's a show that's mainly got these various pundits talking about politics and culture, but George and I, for the past couple of months, have been doing a show on science. And on the show that just aired last Saturday, we talk about how there has been this wave of papers recently showing how the old picture of how genes are inscribed into proteins has become incredibly more complicated. And people realize that this apparently sort of linear process of stretches of DNA being turned into proteins in a developing organism has really fallen apart. And the interactions of genes and the feedback mechanisms and the nonlinear processes are just immensely more complicated than anybody had thought. And I believe that this explains why, first of all, some of these really simplistic genetic explanations of human behavior and various traits and disorders have failed. And also, I think it explains why, for the past 15 years or so, there have been all these attempts to use genetic therapies for various diseases that are caused by a single mutation. And none of those have worked. Genetic therapy has been just a disaster so far. And I think it's probably because things are much more complicated than anybody had expected. So that's a real paradigm shift happening within genetics right now.
Well, one of the things that keeps coming up, I mean, you mentioned the nature-nurture debate, but one of the things that seems to keep coming up is the confusion between what is the brain and what is the mind. And you mentioned this sort of this kind of gap that there's really not really much understanding of what consciousness really is and what the mind is, and that we know that there's correlate with biology and a correlate with chemicals and electricity happening in the brain, but there's something about mind that seems to defy these explanations, as you say in your book, Undiscovered Mind. Let's kind of bring it into the larger philosophical context here and ask about that, because I think it's a fascinating question, but it's sort of like the elephant in the room when we're talking about mental health or psychiatry or really everything about what it is to be human.
Well, I had another Blogging Heads discussion about this recently with a philosopher, an Australian philosopher named David Chalmers. Now, he's responsible for coining the term the hard problem to describe the problem of trying to explain the mind, a subjective experience. It's sometimes called qualia by philosophers, in physiological terms. So on the one side, you've got neurons and brain components like the amygdala or the frontal cortex, these physical objects and physical processes. On the other side, you have perception and memory and emotion, these subjective constituents on of our mind. So the question, and this is an ancient question, goes back to the ancient Greeks, is how do you go from these physical components and processes to these subjective phenomena? And this is sometimes called the explanatory gap, the gap between the physical and the mental. And Chalmers has suggested that to bridge this gap, we might need a whole new way of framing reality, which incorporates the concept of information as well as physical entities. And to me, it's I don't find this very persuasive. I actually have become more optimistic recently that the explanatory gap can be bridged and the mind-body problem can be solved by something called the neural code. Now, this is a phrase that most people haven't even heard of yet, and I'm doing my best to popularize it because I think the neural code is the single most important and significant problem in science today, and maybe ever.
So tell us about that.
Okay. Oh, I'm glad you asked. So the neural code is the best way to think of it as kind of the software that runs on that makes your brain run. So as far as neuroscientists can tell, information in the brain is represented by these electrical signals that are transmitted from one brain cell or neuron to the next. It's these little sort of biochemical packets with an electrical charge that jump from one cell to the other. And these are sort of analogous to the packets of electrons that run through digital computers. So the question is, what is the analog in the brain of what you would call the machine code of a modern computer? What's the software? What's the internal language of the brain that translates these pulses into perception and memory and emotion and so forth? This is the neural code. And if scientists can somehow crack the neural code, I think they might have a way to solve, I think this might be the only possible way to solve some of these ancient riddles like the mind-body problem or the problem of free will.
But
how do we get this sense that we have of being sort of autonomous creatures with choices in the world when what science is really telling us is that everything is physically determined by physical laws when you get right down to the molecular level.
But John, aren't you skeptical of comparisons between computers and machines and the human brain and mind and consciousness? Because we're talking about a level of complexity in the mind which is just completely, vastly different than something which as essentially simple as a computer, which is just a large number of on and off switches firing at the extremely high rate.
Absolutely. You know, I guess because I've been such a debunker and critic of science for so long. As a change of pace, I like to be positive every now and then.
Right.
And so I've tried to be as positive as I can be about the neural code, while also pointing out how hideously complex it is. I think you're quite right. It's the most. First of all, it's not only the most important problem; it's also the most complex problem that scientists have ever tried to solve. I mean, it makes particle physics look like a child's game. I wrote an article for Discover magazine a few years ago in which I tried to lay out some of the various approaches for solving the neural code, and it's in what philosophers might call a pre-paradigm stage right now. There is no convergence toward a single solution. There are lots and lots of competing possible solutions for the neural code. And it may be, and I think it's quite probable, that there is no universal neural code in the same sense that there is a universal genetic code, more or less, that all organisms share, not only all humans, but all organisms.
Because we know that the brain is extremely plastic, and unlike DNA, the neurons are shaping themselves and changing and dying and creating and growing and making new pathways, and that's very different than a kind of basically a kind of a straightforward DNA strand.
That's right. In some sense, the neural code of each of us must be unique, must be shaped by our unique experiences and our unique physiology, and not only that, but our neural code changes constantly in response to new experiences, and so neuroscientists are chasing a moving target.
So this is, go ahead.
Well, on the other hand, there have been some tremendous practical advances. I mean, you've probably read about these experiments involving both monkeys and humans, in which they have chips implanted in their brain that can detect neural signals that can be used to move a cursor on a computer or control a robotic arm.
Yeah, I have read about those studies, and they frighten me.
Yeah, well, you should be frightened because the major sponsor of this research right now is the Pentagon. That's a really disturbing aspect of this research. The Pentagon clearly has an interest in crazy sci-fi possibilities like bionic soldiers. In fact, I've been told by people at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency that that's precisely what they're interested in.
Well, when I'm feeling in a more courageous mood, I want to get you back on the show and talk specifically about that whole question of mind control, and because I know you've written a little bit about that, and it's certainly it's a very disturbing but also very important area to look at and to understand. And there's just so much to talk about, John. We're kind of not have a lot of time, but I wanted to see if I could get to just take a few minutes on your work on psychedelics, hallucinogens, and especially maybe because I've taken psychedelics, and one of the things that comes both in a psychedelic experience and also sometimes just in ordinary reality and in spiritual practice that I've done is this sense of, the mind really is everywhere and everything, and consciousness is really something that's intrinsic to all of existence. It's not actually existing inside of our minds, of our brains, or inside of our bodies. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts about psychedelics and how that sort of fits into all these other areas of research that you're doing.
Sure. Well, I'm 53 years old, so I sort of grew up in I'm kind of a tail end of the 60s person. When I grew up, there was tremendous interest in psychedelics, and I dabbled in them myself, and also read lots of books that tried to draw analogies between psychedelic experiences and the sorts of experiences that you'd get in mystical traditions such as Buddhism and Hinduism. And I sort of put all that on the back burner of my life until fairly recently, and then I got back into it when I was doing research for my book, Rational Mysticism, which was an attempt to understand mystical experiences in scientific terms. And it turns out that over the last 10 or 15 years, there has been this revival of legitimate scientific interest in psychedelics. So, there was this original wave of enthusiasm for psychedelics, of scientific enthusiasm for them in the 50s and 60s as a result of the discovery of LSD and psilocybin and some of these other drugs. But then that all collapsed because of Timothy Leary and his shenanigans and this wave of public revulsion over the popular use of psychedelics by young people. But it's been quietly coming back. In fact, at Harvard University, there's a young psychiatrist named John Halpern who is carrying out a study now of the potential of psilocybin for relieving the effects of anxiety in terminal cancer patients. There are studies of psychedelics going on at other universities all around the country, and I think this is I think it's a wonderful thing, because these substances, while they definitely have the potential to be abused, they can tell us a lot about how our brains work, and I think they could also have great therapeutic potential. So I wrote about this all in Rational Mysticism, and I'm continuing to track it with great interest.
So you remain, I guess you describe yourself as an agnostic, but have your experiences with psychedelics and you're sort of looking at these questions given you any sort of larger answers about what is the relationship of mind to nature, and is there something called God, and what sort of we're doing in this reality?
Well, here's what psychedelics have done for me. I think the great danger with psychedelics is that they kind of amplify everything in your brain, the negative and the positive, and they can easily lead to all sorts of delusional experiences and then beliefs. And I think they can also lead you to become, your psychedelic experiences can be so sort of glittery and extraordinary that when you come back down to ordinary reality, it looks sort of humdrum. Now, it should work at its best. It does work in the opposite way. For me, the best trips that I've had, they sort of pull the veil off things, and I realize what a miracle it is to be alive. So I am an agnostic, but I guess because I haven't found any explanation of reality, neither theological nor scientific, that makes any sense to me. But the psychedelic vision has helped me realize that it is just incredible, astonishing that we're here at all. Existence is infinitely improbable, and in that sense, a miracle. And that actually meshes with what science tells me about existence. I think science has shown that the creation of the universe and the origin of life on Earth were incredibly improbable events. There's no reason for us to be here, and yet here we are.
Wow, that's really inspiring. We are just about out of time. I want to make sure that people have information about your books and your blogging show and your website. So can you just give those to us again?
Sure. Well, you can get links to all of my Amazon. URLs for all my books and links to a bunch of the articles that I've mentioned in our discussion and Blogging Heads TV. If you just go to my personal website, which is johnhorgan.org.
John Horgan, thank you very much for joining us today on Madness Radio.
Okay, thank you, Will. I enjoyed it.
You've been listening to an interview with John Horgan. John is a science journalist and director of the Center for Science Writings at the Stevens Institute for Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. He's a former senior writer at Scientific American. He's also written for Discover Magazine and the New York Times. You can find out more information about John and his work, including his books, The Undiscovered Mind, How the Human Brain Defies Replication, Medication, and Explanation, Rational Mysticism, and The End of Science, by going to John's website, which is johnhorgan.org. That's about all the time we have this week on Madness Radio. Thanks a lot for tuning in. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio is broadcast every Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJ-LP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio in Northampton, Massachusetts. For our live internet stream, podcasting, show archives, and more, visit madnessradio.net. Madness Radio is co-produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project. For more information, check out freedom-center.org and theicarusproject.net. For more mental health radio, listen to the News Hour from mindfreedom.org, Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have an idea for a story or guest on Madness Radio, or you just want to share what's in your head, contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.